I was 17 when my entire life was erased without warning. I came home from school expecting the usual silence, but instead the house felt hollow in a way I couldn't explain at first. No furniture out of place, no signs of a rush. Just an emptiness that pressed against my chest as I walked room to room calling out names that never answered. On the kitchen counter sat a single folded piece of paper, placed carefully like it mattered more than I did. It held for words that would follow me for years. "You'll figure it out." At first, I thought it was a joke or some kind of punishment I didn't understand yet. I kept rereading the note, convinced there had to be more somewhere else. There wasn't. My parents and my younger brother were gone, and with them went any sense that I had ever truly belonged there. I stood in that kitchen for hours, trying to remember what I could have done wrong. What argument I might have missed, what sign I should have seen coming. Eventually it sank in that this wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. Looking back, I realized the abandonment didn't start that day. It had been quietly happening for years. When I was 13, I baked my mother a birthday cake from scratch. Proud of the uneven layers and the frosting I stayed up till late perfecting. She took one look at it and laughed, calling it clumpy before pushing it aside. At 15, I spent nights tutoring my brother, Aaron, so he wouldn't fail his finals, only to have him roll his eyes, call me a know-it-all, and slam his bedroom door in my face. At 16, I handed my entire paycheck to my father so he could cover bills, and months later he screamed at me for bringing it up after calling me useless. I was always needed, but never cherished. A week after the note, my landlord knocked on the door I no longer had a right to answer. He told me the lease had been terminated early, and that my family had already moved 2 states away. I had 7 days to leave. I nodded like I understood, even thanked him, because I had already learned that showing pain never changed anything. I spent 3 nights rotating between friends' couches until the polite excuses started running out. By the 4th night, I was alone. I used the last of my savings to rent a small storage unit, and slept in the back of it, curling up between boxes I didn't own. I snuck into the YMCA to shower, learned which lockers had broken locks, and ate peanut butter straight from the jar for every meal. I applied for jobs on library computers, smiled at strangers, and pretended my life wasn't collapsing. Eventually, a diner hired me for the night shift. The manager, a woman named Carla, didn't ask many questions. She paid me cash, let me rest in the break room when my knees buckled from exhaustion, and treated me with a fairness I wasn't used to. That first year was survival, nothing more. I saved every receipt, bought a prepaid phone, and watched free videos about budgeting and goal setting late at night. I told myself over and over that this wasn't permanent, that I just had to keep moving forward. The real shift came when a regular at the diner offered me a temporary job clearing out old office files. It paid 3 times what I made serving tables, and I said yes, without hesitation. One job led to another. I showed up early, asked questions, and learned fast because failure wasn't an option. By 22, I was freelancing full-time. By 25, I launched a consulting business with nothing but a folding table and a borrowed laptop. By 27, I had contractors working under me, my own office, and clients I once thought were untouchable. When I was 29, I opened my banking app and saw 7 figures for the first time. Real money, real savings, no debt, a retirement account, and health insurance I could actually afford. I cried until my chest hurt, not from joy alone, but from the release of 12 years of pressure. During all of that time, my family never reached out. Not once. I saw Aaron's face pop up in a suggested friends list one night and stared at it longer than I care to admit. He was married now, living in the same state they'd vanished to. I wondered if he ever talked about me, if his wife knew I existed, or if I'd been erased entirely from their story. I didn't hate them. I wished I did. What I felt was worse than anger. It was grief. I started therapy because I didn't want to stay broken. My therapist, Claire, helped me name things I'd buried and build boundaries I'd never been allowed to have. I made a mental list of people who had shown up for me when they didn't have to. Coworkers, classmates, strangers who offered small kindnesses that kept me alive. Those people became my definition of family. Last week, a podcast interview I did about surviving family estrangement went viral. Within 4 days, it hit 1 million views. My inbox filled with messages from people thanking me for putting their pain into words. Then one email stopped me cold. The subject line read, "You're still our daughter." It was from my mother. There was no apology, just a carefully worded message about hearing my side and maybe talking. A second email followed shortly after. This one from Aaron. "We miss you. Can we fix this?" I stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop. I didn't respond right away. Claire advised me to wait at least a week, to give myself space to feel whatever came up without rushing into a decision. I tried to focus on my routine, work, the gym, dinners with friends, but those emails followed me everywhere. When I finally replied, it was to Aaron, and it was only one question. What changed? His answer came quickly. He said the podcast made him realize what they'd done. He reminded me he'd only been 15, said he hadn't had a choice, that he'd thought about me over the years but never had the courage to reach out. He said he was proud of me. I didn't fully believe him, and when I asked why he waited until I was publicly successful, his next message told me everything I needed to know. Money was tight. Their lives were hard. They needed help. I closed my laptop and felt the old weight settle in my chest again. Heavier now because I knew this wasn't about love. It never had been. 10 days passed before I answered anyone. When I finally did, I kept it simple and controlled, choosing my brother first because it felt less loaded. I typed one sentence, reread it 3 times, then sent it before I could talk myself out of it. I asked what had changed after all these years. His reply came within an hour, long and emotional, filled with explanations that felt rehearsed. He said, hearing my story publicly shook him, that he'd been young and scared back then, that he'd wondered about me more than I knew, and that seeing what I'd built made him proud. I wanted to believe him, but something about the timing bothered me. Pride had apparently taken 12 years and a viral podcast to surface. I pressed him on that, and his next message dropped the truth he'd been circling. Things were hard for them now. Money was tight. Our parents' business had failed years ago. Debts had piled up, and his wife was expecting another baby. Medical bills were becoming overwhelming. As I read, my stomach sank in that familiar way that told me I was being positioned, not reconnected with. I didn't respond right away. A week later, my mother emailed again, this time attaching old photos. Pictures of me as a baby, smiling in a way I didn't remember. Beach trips from when I was little. One image of Aaron and me building a snowman, bundled up and laughing like everything was fine. At the bottom of the email, she wrote that they'd made mistakes and wanted to make things right. The photos felt like props from someone else's life. Evidence of a version of family that hadn't survived reality. I brought everything to Claire in our next session. She listened quietly, then reminded me that I was in control, that closure didn't have to mean reconciliation, and that understanding could exist without access. Part of me wanted to scream at my parents, another part wanted answers, and an embarrassing, deeply buried part still wanted their approval. I hated that piece of myself. But pretending it didn't exist hadn't helped me before. I agreed to meet Aaron alone, without our parents. We chose a coffee shop in Chicago, roughly halfway between our cities. I flew in that morning, checked into a hotel, and nearly canceled the meeting more times than I can count. When I walked into the cafe at 2 o'clock, I recognized him instantly despite the changes. He looked older, heavier, with thinning hair. But his eyes were the same ones that used to follow me around the house when we were kids. We didn't hug. We sat across from each other like strangers, hands wrapped around coffee cups we barely touched. The first 20 minutes were awkward and painful, filled with comments about the weather and travel delays. Then he apologized. He said my name, Alina, like he was testing it, and told me he was sorry, that he'd been a kid, that he hadn't known until it was too late. I watched his face carefully, searching for cracks, for anything that felt false. I asked him the question that had haunted me for over a decade. Why was I the one left behind? He stared down at his coffee before answering. He said our parents always saw me as the strong one, the independent one, the one who would be fine on my own. They convinced themselves I didn't need them the way he did. Hearing it out loud was surreal. Strength, apparently, had made me disposable. I told him the truth then. About the storage unit, the peanut butter meals, the YMCA showers, the night shifts at 17. His face collapsed as I spoke, disbelief turning into shame. He whispered that he hadn't known, that our parents told him I had a plan, that I chose to stay behind, that I was living with friends. Every word felt like another small betrayal layered onto the first dot. By the end of the meeting, I was emotionally exhausted. Aaron showed me pictures of his family, talked about his job as an accountant, and asked about my work without directly asking for help. When we stood to leave, he hugged me. I let him, but I didn't return it. I felt numb, unsure whether remorse erased responsibility. That night, back in my hotel room, I called Claire and told her everything. She pointed out something I hadn't wanted to admit, that Aaron still framed himself as powerless rather than accountable. He'd been 15, not 5. Old enough to reach out at some point. Old enough to question the story he'd been fed. Acknowledging that hurt, but it also grounded me. The next call came from my mother. I didn't know how she got my number, but curiosity overrode instinct and I answered. Her voice sounded older, thinner, and she cried as soon as she heard me. She talked about how proud she was, how she'd always known I would succeed, how special I was. I let her talk until the words felt empty. Then I asked her why they'd left me. Her answer was blunt. They were drowning in debt. They couldn't afford to take care of all of us. They thought I was smart enough to figure it out, that I'd find help, that I'd be better off elsewhere. She said they believed they were doing me a favor. I hung up without saying goodbye, blocked her number, and screamed into a pillow until my throat burned. The following morning, an email arrived from my father. It was the first time he'd contacted me since I was 17. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just a detailed explanation of how difficult their lives had been and how desperate things were now. At the very end, he asked if I could help them financially. I forwarded the email to Claire with a subject line that said everything. She called me immediately, and we spent an hour talking about boundaries, about the difference between compassion and obligation, about what I actually wanted. By Monday, I had my answer. I emailed Aaron and told him I was open to having a relationship with him and his family, but with clear limits. No money, no loans, and no contact with our parents until they took full responsibility for what they'd done. His response came fast and stung more than I expected. He said he was disappointed, that families should support each other, and that I was being selfish with my success. I didn't reply. Instead, I booked another session with Claire and scheduled a vacation, needing distance to think clearly. A few days later, Aaron left a voicemail apologizing for his message, saying he understood my position and would respect my boundaries. I listened twice, trying to decide if it was sincerity or strategy, and chose to give him one cautious chance while keeping my guard firmly in place. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that setting boundaries would provoke a storm rather than calm it, but I felt something shift inside me anyway. For the first time, I wasn't reacting, I was choosing. I left for my trip anyway, even with everything unresolved. I told myself the distance would help me see things clearly, and maybe that was true. But mostly I just needed to breathe somewhere my parents couldn't reach me. For 2 weeks, I woke up to ocean air and unfamiliar sounds, walked long stretches of beach, and tried to sit with thoughts I'd spent years outrunning. I didn't feel peaceful exactly, but I felt steadier, like the ground under me wasn't constantly shifting. When I came back, reality rushed in all at once. My inbox was full. 6 emails from my father, each more frantic than the last, their subject lines practically vibrating with urgency. I didn't open them. There was also a message from Aaron asking if we could talk again. Against my better judgment, I agreed to a phone call. Nothing more. I told myself I was doing this carefully, on my terms. The call started calmly. He apologized again for pushing me about money and said he'd been thinking a lot about our last conversation. He told me he'd started therapy, which I wanted to believe mattered. We talked about neutral things at first, his kids, my work, ordinary details that almost made things feel normal. Then he mentioned that our parents were planning to visit him the following weekend. He asked, gently at first, if I'd consider meeting them for just an hour in a public place. My chest tightened immediately. I told him I wasn't ready. He pushed a little, then stopped when my voice went quiet. After we hung up, I called Claire for an emergency session. She helped me see what I hadn't wanted to admit, that I wasn't afraid because I hated my parents, but because some part of me still wanted their approval. I cried in her office, embarrassed by that truth but relieved to finally say it out loud. The next message came faster than I expected. Aaron texted that our mother had cried all night after hearing I wouldn't meet them. He said our father was talking about driving to my city anyway. Panic surged through me, sharp and immediate. I blocked Aaron's number and shut my phone off entirely. I ordered groceries, canceled meetings, and hid in my apartment like the frightened teenager I'd once been. On Wednesday, my building's doorman called to say a couple was asking for me. They wouldn't give their names. I told him I wasn't accepting visitors. Minutes later, my phone rang from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was my father, angry and indignant, saying they'd driven 8 hours to see me and that I was being childish. I deleted the message and turned my phone back off, hands shaking. The next morning, someone pounded on my door. I stayed frozen in bed, heart racing, until the sound stopped. When I finally checked the peephole, my parents were gone, but the damage was done. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I called building security and asked them not to let those people up again. Then I called Claire, who came by on her lunch break, brought me food, and reminded me that what they were doing wasn't reconciliation, it was harassment. That afternoon, an email arrived from Aaron, furious and accusatory. He said I'd humiliated our parents, that they were staying in a cheap motel they couldn't afford, that his wife needed surgery and they were desperate. I didn't reply. Instead, I booked a flight to Portland to see my friend Rachel, who'd once let me sleep on her couch when I had nowhere else to go. I trusted her in a way I didn't trust many people. As I packed, another unknown number called. I ignored it. 10 minutes later, the doorman rang again, his voice uneasy. A woman downstairs was asking for me, claiming to be my mother and saying she was having chest pains. I told him to call an ambulance if she needed help but that I wasn't coming down. An hour later, as I left for the airport, he told me she'd been taken to the hospital. Guilt flickered briefly, then hardened into resolve. At the airport, Aaron called again. I answered this time. He was crying, saying our mother had suffered a heart attack and that it was my fault for stressing her out. I hung up and called Claire instead. She told me firmly that I was not responsible for my mother's health and urged me to get on my plane and take care of myself. I listened. The weekend with Rachel was grounding in a way I hadn't expected. She remembered everything. The night I showed up with a backpack and nowhere to go, the months after when I barely spoke. She was furious on my behalf and made no attempt to hide it. Having someone so firmly in my corner felt like oxygen. When I returned home, flowers sat outside my apartment door. The card asked me to call them and mentioned the hotel they were staying at. No apology, no respect for boundaries, just another demand. I threw them away. The next day, a photo arrived from an unknown number, my mother pale in a hospital bed, accompanied by a message asking if I really wanted to live with this regret. I blocked the number and called Claire again, who suggested I change my phone number and take a social media break. Before I could leave town again, the doorman called one more time. A young woman was downstairs with a small child, claiming to be my exhausted and cornered. I told him to send her up. When she knocked, she looked nothing like the manipulative caricature I'd built in my head. She introduced herself as Maya, holding a sleeping toddler against her shoulder, and asked if we could talk. Inside my apartment, she laid her daughter on the couch and told me the truth as she knew it. She'd only learned about me a few years ago and had been told I ran away. Hearing my podcast had shocked her, and she confronted Aaron, who finally admitted what happened. She said she was horrified by my parents' behavior and embarrassed that they'd tried to involve me financially. Her surgery, she clarified, was covered by insurance. The real financial trouble belonged to my parents. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. My parents had been telling people for years that I'd abandoned them, that I was unstable, that I'd stolen money before disappearing. She showed me posts, dated years after I'd been left behind, painting them as victims. When she threatened to expose the truth, they panicked. That was why they were desperate now. After Maya left, I called Claire again, who wasn't surprised. She explained how controlling people often rewrite history to protect themselves. That night, an email arrived from my father threatening legal action if I didn't retract my story and compensate them for damage to their reputation. I forwarded it to a lawyer named Daniel, who called immediately and assured me the threats were empty. He told me to save everything and not respond. The next day, Aaron left a voicemail sounding terrified. He said our parents were furious with Maya and that he was afraid they'd do something reckless. At Daniel's suggestion, we agreed to meet in a public place with him present. When they arrived, both Aaron and Maya looked exhausted and shaken. What came out during that meeting was worse than I'd imagined. My parents had been financially and emotionally controlling Aaron for years, living off him, criticizing him, and escalating when challenged. When Maya confronted them, my father had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise it. Daniel advised them to change locks, passwords, and bank accounts immediately, and suggested they seek their own legal counsel. As we left, Aaron hugged me, and this time I hugged him back. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition. That night, my parents sent a flood of unhinged messages. I blocked every number. The following morning, Maya called sobbing. My parents had broken into their house, stolen documents and photos, and left a note saying family matters should stay in the family. I told her to call the police and drove over immediately, knowing with terrifying certainty that this was no longer just about the past. When I arrived at Aaron and Maya's house, a police car was already parked out front, lights off but presence heavy. Inside, Drawers were pulled open and papers littered the floor like the aftermath of a storm. Aaron sat hunched on the couch with his head in his hands while Maya walked an officer through what was missing. Her voice shaking but steady. I introduced myself as family and stood beside them, feeling a strange mix of rage and clarity. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was escalation. The officer asked if they were sure it wasn't a misunderstanding. If perhaps the house key had been used with permission. Maya lifted her sleeve and showed the fading bruise on her arm. Her jaw tight as she explained the pattern of threats and pressure. Notes were taken, but I could tell skepticism lingered. After the police left, we cleaned together in silence, finding more missing items with each room. Old photo albums, financial documents, a spare car key. Aaron kept repeating that this was his fault, that he should have stopped it years ago. I didn't argue. There was no point. Daniel arrived not long after, surveyed the scene, and said this changed everything. Breaking and entering crossed a legal line that couldn't be smoothed over with excuses. He advised all of us to stay somewhere else for a few days and promised to file emergency restraining orders first thing in the morning. We nodded, too tired to push back. Maya packed bags while Aaron and I changed locks again, checked windows, and talked through security cameras. It felt surreal, preparing defenses against our own parents. But fear has a way of clarifying priorities. As we were leaving, Aaron's phone buzzed. He showed me the screen with shaking hands. 3 words from our father glared back at us. "We're watching you." I took a screenshot and sent it to Daniel immediately, then made a decision that surprised even me. I told them they were coming to stay with me. My building had security, cameras, and a doorman who already knew not to let those people up. They agreed without hesitation, relief written all over their faces. That night, the 4 of us ate takeout on my living room floor. Maya's daughter Iris played quietly with a stuffed bear while the adults spoke in low voices about next steps and worst-case scenarios. The apartment felt different with people in it, louder and messier than I was used to, but also warmer. We were bound together by something ugly, but there was comfort in not being alone with it. For the first time, I felt like we were facing the truth instead of running from it. By morning, Daniel confirmed he'd filed emergency restraining orders for all of us, and that we'd need to appear in court the following week. He also mentioned a detective who was taking the break-in more seriously after reviewing the pattern of behavior. We settled into an uneasy routine, working remotely, cooking simple meals, jumping at every unexpected noise. Iris laughed easily, unaware of the tension humming beneath everything. And that innocence made me more determined than ever to stop this cycle here. The next escalation came quietly. A delivery of flowers arrived at the front desk with a note that read, "We know where you are." I told the doorman to refuse them and call the police if necessary, then updated Daniel. He said it strengthened our case. I didn't tell Aaron or Maya about the flowers. They were already stretched thin. Instead, I focused on small acts of normalcy, making dinner, reading Iris a bedtime story, pretending for a few hours that we were just an unconventional household. Late that night, after everyone else was asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The anger, the grief, the fear, and the strange, fragile hope that something better could grow out of this mess. I cried quietly into a towel, not wanting to wake anyone. In the morning, Maya found me making coffee and admitted she wasn't okay either. We sat together, sharing the weight without trying to fix it. And that felt like its own kind of healing. A few days later, Daniel called with news. Security footage from a gas station near Aaron's house showed our parents' car parked there during the time of the break-in. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Monday, and he felt confident. Relief washed over us, quickly followed by anxiety. It felt like waiting for a storm to break. That night, a brick shattered Aaron's car window in my parking garage. No note, no message, just another reminder that fear was the point. Sunday evening, we sat around my dining table rehearsing what to say in court, what facts to present, how to stay calm, how to explain a lifetime of manipulation without sounding unbelievable. The conversation felt detached, like discussing characters in a story instead of our own parents. While we talked, an email notification flashed on my phone. The subject line read, "Last chance." The message was short and threatening, promising regret if we went to court. Daniel told me not to respond. He saved it and added it to the growing file. Monday morning arrived with an eerie calm. We dressed carefully and drove separately to the courthouse, meeting Daniel on the steps outside. Inside, I spotted my parents immediately, standing near the entrance like they belonged there. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, my father rigid with barely contained anger. They watched us pass without speaking. I didn't look back. In the courtroom, Daniel laid out everything methodically. The abandonment, the threats, the break-in, the messages, the patterns. The judge listened closely, asking pointed questions and frowning more deeply with each answer. When my parents spoke, they framed themselves as misunderstood, loving, wronged. When asked directly if they'd left their minor child alone and moved away, my father hesitated. That hesitation said more than any speech could have. The restraining orders were granted for 3 years. No contact, no approaching our homes or workplaces, no messages through third parties. Any violation would result in arrest. My parents looked stunned, like consequences were a foreign concept. As we left, my mother called my name softly. I kept walking, feeling something heavy finally lift out outside. Aaron hugged me tightly and apologized again, his voice breaking. I told him we would be okay, that we had each other now. As we reached our cars, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of Iris playing in a backyard I recognized. Beneath it were 4 words that made my blood run cold. This isn't over yet. I showed Aaron immediately. We called Maya, told her to pick Iris up and meet us at my place. I forwarded the message to Daniel, who said it was a clear violation of the restraining order, and told me to drive straight home. The ride felt endless, every passing car a potential threat. When we finally gathered in my apartment, fear filled the room, thick and suffocating. Police arrived, took statements, promised patrols and investigations. They said all the right things. But I could tell they didn't fully grasp how dangerous desperation can be. After they left, we sat together in silence, trying to decide what came next. Maya suggested hiding in a hotel. Aaron talked about leaving the state. I felt something harden inside me, a resolve born from years of being chased by the past. I stood up and said I was done running. They had taken enough from me already. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living in fear. That night, I took the first watch, sitting in the dark by my window. Around 2 in the morning, I saw a familiar car circle the block and park across the street. My father sat inside, staring up at my building, saying nothing, doing just enough to avoid immediate consequences. I took photos, woke Aaron, and we watched together. In the morning, Daniel confirmed it was concerning but not technically a violation. The law had limits, and that truth settled heavily on me. When Aaron and Maya decided to take Iris to a hotel for a few days, I helped them pack and hugged them goodbye, promising to check in constantly. After they left, my apartment felt too quiet again. I called Claire and told her everything. She asked me a question that cut through the chaos. What did I actually want from my parents? Not what I feared, not what I rejected, but what I wanted. The answer surprised me, and once I saw it clearly, I knew I had reached a turning point. After I hung up with Claire, I sat alone on my couch and wrote down what I wanted, not what I was supposed to want. I wanted safety. I wanted peace. I wanted a future that wasn't dictated by fear or obligation. I wanted a relationship with Aaron and Maya and Iris, built slowly and honestly. Nowhere on that list did forgiveness or reconciliation with my parents appear. Seeing it written out made something click. I didn't need closure from them. I needed freedom from them. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned but suddenly felt inevitable. I emailed my parents directly. The message was short and precise. I told them I knew they were watching my building, that the intimidation had to stop, and that I would meet them one last time to say everything that needed to be said. I named a coffee shop, a time, and made it clear this would be final. No lawyers, no police, just me. After that, they were to leave us all alone forever. I hit send before fear could catch up to me. My father replied within minutes. 3 words. We'll be there. No apology, no argument, just confirmation. I didn't tell Aaron or Maya or Daniel. This wasn't about strategy or legality anymore. It was about ending something that had haunted me since I was 17. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Like deciding to act had quieted something restless inside me. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not to impress them, but to remind myself who I was now. I arrived early, chose a table where I could see the door, and ordered a coffee I barely touched. When they walked in, I felt a flicker of recognition and nothing else. They looked older, smaller, stripped of the authority they once held over me. My mother saw me first. My father followed her gaze. They sat down without asking. I spoke before either of them could start. I told them I wasn't there to reconcile, to give money, or to hear excuses. I told them this meeting was about understanding one thing clearly, that it was over, not just legally, but permanently. I laid out the evidence I had saved, the messages, the threats, the photos, and told them calmly that I had the resources and documentation to expose everything if they continued. I wasn't threatening. I was stating reality. My mother cried, saying they just wanted their family back, that they were scared of growing old alone. I looked at her and felt a strange detachment. I told her that loneliness was a consequence, not a punishment, and that they had made their choices years ago when they abandoned a child and rewrote the story to protect themselves. My father grew angry, accused me of being ungrateful, of turning Aaron against them, of owing them for raising me. I laughed, genuinely, because the idea was so absurd it no longer hurt. I told him I didn't owe gratitude for survival. I owed myself protection. I stood up and told them this was their final warning. Any further contact, any attempt to intimidate or manipulate, would be met with full exposure and legal action. As I turned to leave, my mother asked if I hated them. I paused and told her the truth. I didn't hate them. I felt nothing. And that was something they'd earned all on their own. When I walked out, the air felt lighter, like I'd stepped out from under a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I called Aaron immediately and told him everything. He was upset that I'd gone alone, scared of retaliation, but mostly relieved that someone had finally drawn a line they couldn't pretend not to see. I went to stay with him and Maya at their hotel for a few days, just to be safe. Iris ran into my arms when I arrived and called me Auntie Alina for the first time. I cried then, quietly, because that single word meant more to me than anything my parents had ever said. The days that followed were tense but quiet. No calls, no messages, no sightings. Daniel checked in regularly and confirmed the restraining orders were still in effect and being monitored. Eventually, we learned my parents had returned to their home state. Time passed. A week, then two. The constant knot in my stomach slowly loosened. Aaron and Maya decided to move closer to me, wanting a fresh start away from the places that held too much fear. Aaron found a new job. Maya enrolled Iris in preschool. They bought a house not far from my apartment, and we started having dinner together every Sunday. It was awkward at first, learning how to be family without obligation or secrecy, but it was honest. That mattered more. 6 months later, Daniel forwarded me a letter from my mother, so my address would remain private. I debated not opening it, but curiosity won. This time, there were no demands, no threats, just an acknowledgement that they had failed me, that they understood why I wanted distance, and that they were seeking counseling. They said they would respect the restraining order and accept whatever choice I made. I didn't feel relief or anger. I felt confirmation that I'd made the right decision. I kept the letter in a drawer. Not as an invitation, but as proof that boundaries had finally been heard. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. I still went to therapy. I still flinched at unexpected knocks. Healing wasn't linear, but it was real. And it was mine. Last week, Iris turned 4. We hosted her birthday party at my apartment. Balloons filled the living room. A cake sat proudly on the counter. Friends came and went. Laughter echoed off walls that had once only known silence. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen and watched Aaron spin Iris around while Maya laughed, camera in hand. My home, once so empty, was alive. I thought about that note left on the counter all those years ago. You'll figure it out. I had, not the way they meant, but in the only way that mattered. I figured out what love should look like. I figured out that family can be chosen. I figured out that being left behind didn't define me. What I built afterward did.